Welcome to the deep dive. We have an incredibly specific, really high-stakes mission for our time together today.
We really do. And, for this deep dive, we are opening up the Oxford textbook of global public health.
Right. Our goal is to map out the fundamental architecture of how public health identifies, observes, and then ultimately acts upon human risk. We are talking about the very bedrock of epidemiological science here.
Exactly. And whether you are a medical student prepping for your board exams, maybe a public health trainee trying to make sense of a really dense curriculum, or even a practicing clinician looking to sharpen your epidemiological reasoning, this conversation is custom tailored for you.
Yeah, we are not just going to memorize textbook definitions today or, rattle off a bunch of equations. We are going to build robust conceptual frameworks. We are mapping the journey from exposure to outcome and from targeted intervention to massive system-wide impact.
Because the material we are looking at today is truly foundational. To really elevate how you think about population health, we're focusing on two distinct but deeply connected chapters from the Oxford text. That's Chapter 5.6, which covers cohort studies, and Chapter 11.4, which breaks down population screening.
That is a vast amount of information.
Yeah.
And to make it stick, to really make it intuitive, we are going to anchor our entire discussion in two overarching metaphors.
Right.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I always find that a good metaphor is the absolute best way to anchor complex methodology. So I want you to imagine you are standing in a watchtower.
A very tall watchtower.
Exactly. That is our first metaphor, the watchtower. This represents the cohort study. From this high vantage point, you are looking forward across this vast timeline. You are observing a specific group of people, your cohort starting from a defined point of exposure, and you just simply watch risk unfold over time.
You don't intervene at all.
Right. You don't intervene, you don't hand out medicines, you don't change policies, you just document the natural history of disease exactly as it happens in the real world.
And our second metaphor stands in stark contrast to that passive observation. We call it the selective net. And this represents population screening.
Okay, so we're leaving the tower.
Right. Imagine stepping down from that watchtower and walking all the way to the edge of the ocean. You cast a net into a sea of people who all, and this is crucial, who all presume themselves to be perfectly healthy.
They feel fine.
They feel completely fine. The goal here is to actively catch hidden preclinical disease before it manifests. But as we will explore in depth today, this net is highly imperfect.
Oh, it's incredibly messy.
It catches things it shouldn't, it misses things it should catch, and most profoundly, it alters the trajectory of absolutely everyone it touches.
So we have a really clear path ahead. First, we're going to climb up into the watchtower and master the observational power of the cohort study, because we need to deeply understand how risk works naturally.
You have to know the baseline.
Exactly. Once we have that foundation, we're going to take that understanding of risk and apply it to the complex, ethically fraught, and honestly deeply paradoxical world of casting the selective net in population screening. So let's start with the watchtower, specifically the architecture of temporality in cohort studies.
Temporality is everything here.
It is. The defining feature, as the text emphasizes, is temporality. That simply means the exposure has to precede the outcome. Like a case control study looks backward, you start with sick people and ask what happened in their past. A cohort study starts at the beginning and looks forward.
And we really need to pause on why that temporal sequence matters so much. Establishing that an exposure precedes a disease is one of the absolute fundamental criteria for causal inference.
Right.
If public health officials want to prove that variable X causes outcome Y, they must be absolutely certain that X happened before Y.
But a skeptic might ask, why not just use a randomized controlled trial? Why not just assign people to different exposures and measure the outcome? It seems cleaner.
It would be cleaner, but the reality is that randomized trials for public health hazards are often impossible. Or just highly unethical. You cannot randomly assign one group of healthy teenagers to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 20 years.
No, definitely not.
Or deliberately expose a residential neighborhood to industrial radiation just to see what kind of cancers they develop. You'd lose your medical license and go to prison.
Right, so since we cannot ethically engineer those exposures, we have to find people who are already exposed to these things naturally. We group them into a cohort, and we watch them from our tower. But the textbook makes a really crucial distinction here about how we watch them. It differentiates between concurrent or prospective cohorts and non-concurrent or historical cohorts.
Yes.
And the examples the text gives really bring this to life. Let's look at the famous Framingham Heart Study.
So the Framingham study is the absolute archetype of the concurrent cohort. It began in 1949 in Framingham, Massachusetts. Investigators took a random sample of adults, initially ending up with 5,127 participants.
That's a massive undertaking for 1949.
Huge. They essentially told this town, we're going to give you comprehensive physical examinations every 2 years. We're going to track your diet, your physical activity, your blood pressure, your stress levels. And they just walked forward in time with those participants, concurrently collecting data as the years passed, watching who developed cardiovascular disease and who didn't.
And that is the gold standard for tracking natural history.
Oh,
But it is incredibly slow and agonizingly expensive. I mean, you literally have to wait decades for the diseases to develop and the data to accumulate.
you do.
So what do you do if public health faces an urgent question today and you don't have decades to wait? This is where the non-concurrent or historical cohort comes in. The text brings up the Norwegian electrician study.
That's a fascinating one.
Yeah, researchers wanted to look at the relationship between electromagnetic radiation and cancer. But instead of starting in the present and waiting 30 years, they went back to the 1960 Norwegian Census Registry.
Huh.
They found 37,945 men who reported working as electricians back then. That was their defined exposure group.
And the mechanics of how this works are what make it so powerful. Because even though the data is gathered historically, the logical epidemiological flow is exactly the same as a prospective study.
Right.
You still establish a group based on their exposure at a specific point in time, in this case, working as an electrician in 1960. You then look forward from that point through historical records. You're mining cancer registries, national death indices, tracking those specific individuals up to 1991. The temporality is perfectly preserved.
Because the exposure in 1960 clearly precedes the cancer outcomes evaluated later.
Exactly.
I think that's the piece that usually trips people up. When they hear historical, they think looking backward from the disease like a case control study.
Yeah.
But you are still standing in a historical watchtower looking forward through the archives.
That's a great way to visualize it.
So moving on to how we actually define these populations and figure out where the starting line is. Who actually gets to be in a cohort? The text shows us it can be a total population. They mention a massive study of 84,349 Dutch males who were all born in 1932 and underwent military physicals at age 18. I mean, that is an entire birth year's worth of data for a country.
It's incredible. Or it can be geographic samples, like the ERIC study, which looked at atherosclerosis risk in specific communities.
But quite often, public health needs to study a highly specific, high-risk group. The textbook details the multicenter AIDS cohort study, or the MACS.
Right.
This started in 1984, which is before HIV was even fully understood as the causative agent of AIDS. They enrolled over 4,900 men who have sex with men across 4 major U.S. metropolitan areas.
And the rationale there was that this specific population was experiencing a devastating, completely unprecedented outbreak. Public health desperately needed to understand the natural history of this terrifying new syndrome.
And when you are tracking a disease like that, you have to define the origin. What epidemiologists call time zero. If you are studying the biology of aging, time zero is birth. If you are studying a workplace hazard, time zero is the day the worker was hired at the factory.
Simple enough.
But in the MACS cohort, time zero is the moment of HIV infection. And this brings up a massive complication in the real world, because not everyone enters the study exactly at time zero.
No, they don't. And that leads to the critical distinction between incident and prevalent cohorts. An incident cohort is the ideal scenario. You follow individuals exactly from the origin point. You witness the exposure and track them forward from day one.
The perfect watchtower view.
Right. But in reality, like with the MACS cohort, 41% of the men were already HIV positive when they joined the study in 1984. They had survived a certain amount of time since their origin of infection before they were ever enrolled. This creates what we call a prevalent cohort.
Okay, let me push back on that for a second, because this leads to a mind-bending statistical concept the text calls left truncation, or dealing with late entries.
It's tricky.
Yeah. If you have an exposure, say a massive toxic chemical spill, and you start your study 5 years after the spill, you only enroll people who are still alive to sign the consent forms. The text says you have to mathematically account for the ghosts, the unseen peers who were exposed, developed the disease quickly, and died before your study even began. And here's my question, if they aren't in the study, why do we have to account for them? Isn't that just missing data?
It goes much deeper than just missing data. It fundamentally skews your understanding of the disease's lethality. If you don't account for those truncated individuals mathematically, your denominator is entirely corrupted.
How so?
Well, you will falsely conclude that the toxic spill is much less lethal than it actually is, because your study population is exclusively composed of people biologically hardy enough to have survived those first 5 years unnoticed. You are observing a survivor bias in action.
Wow, that is a terrifying policy blind spot. If we don't account for the ghosts in the data, the government might look at the cohort and say, look, the chemical spill wasn't that bad, most of these people are fine, completely missing the fact that the most vulnerable people were wiped out before the clipboard even arrived.
Exactly. You're only looking at the strong survivors.
Okay, so we have our cohort in our watchtower. Now we have to look at the exposures. And exposures are not just a simple yes or no binary switch. They are deeply complex and they fluctuate over time. The text breaks this down into internal versus external time-dependent exposures.
Right. So an internal time-dependent exposure is a variable that changes at the individual, biological, or behavioral level. For instance, a participant might smoke 10 cigarettes a day in year 1, quit entirely in year 3, and then start smoking 20 a day in year 5.
It bounces around.
Exactly. Or, in the case of the MACS cohort, their CD4 immune cell count fluctuates over time based on their individual biology and the virus's progression. These are internal clocks ticking within each participant.
But external variables change at the population level, completely outside the individual's control, like calendar time, seasonal weather, or massive policy changes.
Right.
Let's go back to the MACS cohort in HIV. In 1995, something miraculous happened. Highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HART, was introduced. This was a massive external population-level change. And the text points out that researchers could use this distinct line in the calendar to measure something incredible.
They used that external calendar shift to distinguish between individual effectiveness and population effectiveness.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. Individual effectiveness is simply looking at one specific patient who takes the drug and seeing how their specific viral load responds. Basic clinical medicine. But population effectiveness looks at the entire system. By comparing the survival of the entire MACS cohort before 1995 to their survival after 1995, researchers didn't just measure a drug, they measured how a systemic intervention shifted the entire survival curve of a disease across a population.
And the human stakes of those numbers in the text are just staggering.
Yeah.
In the era before HART, the median survival time after an AIDS diagnosis was about 1.5 years. But by the time HART was well established, between 2001 and 2005, that median survival time increased tenfold. We are talking about giving people decades of life back.
It's one of the greatest public health triumphs in modern history.
Truly. And that is the ultimate power of a cohort study. You are watching history change human biology in real time. But of course, in the real world, our watchtower view is never perfect. We have missing data. The text calls this censoring.
Yes. Censoring is an unavoidable reality of absolutely every longitudinal study. You rarely get to observe the outcome for every single participant.
Right.
The most common type is right censoring. Imagine the timeline of a participant moving from left to right on a graph. At some point, the line just stops before they develop the disease. Maybe the study runs out of funding and administratively ends. Maybe the participant moves to another country and dropped out, which lost to follow up.
Or they get hit by a bus.
Exactly. They die in a car accident, a completely unrelated cause of death. We know they survived up to that specific point on the right side of their timeline, but their future is essentially blank.
There's also interval censoring. That is when you know an event happened, but you don't know exactly when. For example, a participant comes in for a clinic visit in January, and they are perfectly healthy. They come back in July, and they have a disease. You know, the disease started somewhere in that 6-month interval, but you don't know if it was February or June.
Right.
But the text issues a massive warning here about something called informative censoring or selection bias. Let me play devil's advocate again. If someone drops out of a study, they drop out. Why does it matter why they dropped out?
Because if the censoring isn't random, it is a critical threat to the study's internal validity. Suppose you're running a cohort study on a progressive, debilitating disease. Over time, the sickest patients stop coming to your clinic visits. They're too weak, too ill to travel, or they've been hospitalized elsewhere.
So they miss their appointments.
Exactly. They officially become lost to follow-up. Now, if you just treat them as standard right-censored data, assuming they were doing fine the last time you saw them, your overall survival curves will look artificially optimistic. You are systematically losing your absolute worst-case scenarios from the dataset.
It is like evaluating the safety of a parachute, but only getting survey responses from the people whose parachutes actually opened.
That's a perfect analogy.
Of course, the data looks fantastic because the people who experienced the failure aren't around to fill out the survey. So, knowing all these pitfalls, the ghosts of left truncation, the moving targets of time-dependent exposures, the black holes of informative censoring, how do we actually crunch the numbers from our watchtower? The textbook provides three main analytical frameworks. Let's start with the first, person time, which utilizes Poisson regression.
So person time is a vital epidemiological tool to handle data when participants are followed for entirely different lengths of time. Instead of just counting people, you count the years of life they contribute to the study while they are at risk.
Right.
So one person followed for 10 years contributes 10 person years. 10 people followed for 1 year also contribute 10 person years. You then calculate the incidence rate by dividing the number of events, like a disease diagnosis, by the total person years.
And the textbook illustrates this with the precursors study, which is a really fascinating cohort. They tracked 1,337 medical students who graduated from Johns Hopkins between 1948 and 1964. They wanted to see the precursors to cardiovascular disease and mortality. So they tracked the person years of the smokers versus the non-smokers. This is an internal comparison within the cohort.
Right.
And the math yielded a standardized mortality ratio, SMR, of 1.9 for the smokers compared to the non-smokers, meaning the smokers within that group were nearly twice as likely to die.
That internal comparison is very robust. But the anomaly appears when they performed an external comparison. They took the entire cohort of Hopkins medical students, smokers and non-smokers combined, and compared their mortality rates to the general white male population of the United States.
And what happened?
That generated an SMR of 0.54, meaning as a group, the medical students were dying at almost half the rate of the general public.
Right. Why does that happen?
Right.
Because of what epidemiologists call the healthy worker effect, or in this specific case, a massive socioeconomic advantage. Medical students generally have significantly better access to healthcare, better living conditions, better nutrition, higher incomes than the average public. Even the smokers in this highly privileged group fared better against all-cause mortality than the average American.
It proves that while absolute numbers might be wildly skewed by the unrepresentative nature of a specific cohort, the relative internal comparisons like smokers versus non-smokers within that same Hopkins group remain highly valid.
So that's person time. Our second analytical framework is survival analysis. This is essential when we were looking at the time to event. The text highlights the Kaplan-Meier curve. If you look at a Kaplan-Meier curve on a page, it looks like a descending staircase. It starts at 100% survival on the left, and every time someone in the cohort experiences the event, the line steps down. But I want to expand on the metaphor the text hints at here, because visualizing the math is crucial for you as a listener. Imagine the Kaplan-Meier curve is the physical path you are walking down a mountain. The height you are at represents how many people are still walking with you. Every time someone trips and falls off the path, you step down a little lower. But the hazard function, which is the other side of survival analysis, is the steepness of the cliff you might fall off at any given step.
That's exactly it. The hazard function is the instantaneous rate of the event happening right now, given that you have survived up to this exact moment.
And to analyze these hazards, we use regression models. The most famous is the Cox proportional hazards model. The text defines this as a semi-parametric model. Now, wait, let's pause right there. What does semi-parametric actually mean in plain English? Are we saying we know the shape of the data, or are we just making an educated guess?
It is a hybrid approach. Think of it like a race between two runners on a track. The non-parametric part means we make zero assumptions about the actual shape of the hazard over time. The hazard could fluctuate wildly. Maybe the runners sprint, then jog, then walk, then sprint again. We don't have to define that underlying baseline hazard.
Okay, so what's the parametric part?
The parametric part, and this is the absolute key to the Cox model, assumes that the relative hazard between the exposed and unexposed groups remains constant or proportional over time. If the runner representing our smoker is twice as likely to trip and fall at minute 10, the model assumes they are still twice as likely to trip at minute 50. The baseline risk can change, but the ratio of risk between the two groups stays proportionally locked.
That makes perfect sense. But sometimes risk doesn't stay perfectly proportional. What if a drug is incredibly dangerous in the first week, but perfectly safe after a month? That's where the text introduces fully parametric models, specifically the generalized gamma models. These are incredibly mathematically flexible.
Very flexible.
They can handle a hazard that is constantly increasing, like the risk of dying from old age. They can handle a decreasing hazard, like the risk of organ rejection immediately following a transplant surgery. They can even handle a bathtub-shaped hazard, where risk is very high early on, drops low in the middle, and spikes again later in life. You are actually defining the shape of the curve.
Which brings us to the third framework, longitudinal data analysis. This is used when the outcome you care about isn't a single definitive event like death or a heart attack. Instead, it's a moving biomarker. Think of a patient's kidney filtration rate, their blood pressure trajectory, or their lung capacity measured repeatedly over time.
And the textbook mentions an incredible study from East Boston in the 1970s to illustrate this. Researchers tracked the pulmonary function of growing children over time to measure the effect of maternal smoking. They didn't just wait to see if the kids developed asthma. They mapped the trajectory of their lung growth year by year.
It was seminal research.
It proved the insidious dangers of secondhand smoke. But how do you model that mathematically when a kid's lung capacity this year is obviously tied to what it was last year?
Analyzing that kind of correlated data requires specialized models because you are taking repeated measurements of the exact same person. You can use marginal models, which essentially look at the population average. You can use conditional models, predicting a current state based on past states. Or you can use random effects models.
Random effects models are fascinating to me. If we think about a marathon, a marginal model just looks at the massive blob of runners moving down the street. But a random effects model acknowledges that while the whole population has an average trajectory, every single individual has their own unique biological starting line, their intercept, and their own unique pace, their slope.
Yes, the model captures the grand population trend while mathematically respecting the messy, random variance of individual human biology.
That synthesis perfectly encapsulates the power of the Watchtower. We have observed temporality, we have managed censoring, we have quantified exposures, and we have modeled the natural flow of risk and disease using sophisticated mathematics.
We have.
Okay, take a deep breath. Because we are about to leave the safety of our Watchtower. We've seen how risk unfolds naturally. But what happens when public health decides it cannot just passively watch anymore? What if the state wants to intervene before symptoms even appear? We are walking down to the water, and we are casting the selective net. Welcome to Part 2. Population screening.
The transition from clinical medicine or observational cohort studies to population screening is one of the most profound ethical and operational shifts in all of healthcare.
It really is.
The textbook uses definitions from McCune and the UK National Screening Committee to make this incredible explicit. Screening is actively offering a test to a defined population of people who presume themselves to be perfectly healthy and who have not asked for any medical advice.
I really want to linger on that because that is the core difference. In normal clinical medicine, you feel a lump or you have a terrible persistent cough and you go to the doctor and ask for help. You are initiating the interaction.
Right.
In screening, you are sitting at home feeling fantastic, living your life, and the government or your healthcare provider sends you a letter saying, please come in, we want to look inside you for hidden diseases.
And that completely inverts the ethical burden.
Right.
When a sick patient asks a doctor for help, that patient intrinsically accepts the risks of treatment because they are already suffering. But when a provider invites a presumed healthy person in for a test, there is an implicit promise being made that the test will provide a net benefit to their life.
A huge promise.
Therefore, the burden of proof required to ensure you do not cause harm is astronomically higher.
We also really need to differentiate systematic population screening from what doctors do in their clinics every day, what's called opportunistic case finding. If you are a diabetic and your doctor checks your eyes for retinal disease during a routine checkup, that is case finding. You're already a patient, and they are managing a known elevated risk.
Yes.
Systematic screening is mailing a colon cancer test kit to every single 50-year-old in the country, regardless of their health status or family history.
Furthermore, we must establish that a screening test is not a diagnostic test. That is a massive public misconception. A screening test is merely a risk stratification tool. It divides a massive population into two groups. Those at low risk, who are sent home and told to return in a few years, and those at high risk, who are then sent on to get actual definitive diagnostic testing, like a biopsy.
But casting this net creates a bizarre psychological phenomenon. The textbook introduces something called the popularity paradox, described by researchers Raffel and Gray. It is fascinating and honestly a little terrifying. Basically, all screening programs overdiagnose to some extent.
They all do.
They find harmless cellular anomalies that look like cancer under a microscope, but would never have actually progressed to kill the patient.
The problem is, once you find that cellular anomaly, you treat it because you can't be sure. But the patient doesn't know it was a harmless anomaly. They get a positive screen, they undergo surgery, perhaps radiation, and they are told by their doctors that their life was saved.
Wait, so you're telling me that the worse a screening program is, the more false positives and overdiagnoses it generates, the more popular it becomes with the public.
Yes, that is the paradox. The more people a program unnecessarily harms through overdiagnosis and painful treatments, the more people are absolutely convinced the program saved their life.
That is a massive blind spot in public health policy. It creates massive emotional public advocacy groups demanding the screening program continue, even if the cold, hard epidemiology proves it is doing more harm than good on a population level. I mean, how do you argue against 1,000 people saying, this test saved my life, with a spreadsheet showing it actually didn't?
It's nearly impossible politically. Which brings us to the rules of engagement. Because of these immense risks, biases, and paradoxes, you cannot just screen a population for whatever you feel like. In 1968, the World Health Organization published the Wilson and Jungmer criteria, which have been updated since by bodies like the UK National Screening Committee. These are the absolute pillars that must be met before a net is cast.
Let's methodically walk through them, because they are the bedrock of policy. First, the condition must be an important health problem. You don't screen for something trivial. Second, we have to deeply understand its natural history, which is exactly why we need those cohort studies from our watchtower.
Exactly.
Third, there must be a latent or early symptomatic stage we can actually catch. If a disease goes from undetectable to terminal in 3 days, screening is useless. Fourth, we need a simple, safe, and clinically validated test. Fifth, there must be an agreed-upon cutoff level for what constitutes a positive.
And crucially, the sixth pillar. There must be an effective treatment available for the patients identified. This is an ethical absolute. Screening a population for a devastating terminal disease for which there is absolutely no treatment or intervention is ethically unjustified. You are not providing a health benefit. You are simply delivering immense psychological anxiety and despair years earlier than necessary without offering any solution.
Finally, the whole program, from the testing to the diagnostic follow-up to the treatment, must be cost-effective. Which brings us to the mechanics of the net itself. The test properties. The text talks about sensitivity, the ability of the net to catch the true positives, the people who actually have the hidden disease. And specificity, the ability of the net to correctly ignore the true negatives, letting the healthy fish swim right through without getting caught.
And clinicians and the general public almost exclusively obsess over sensitivity. They say, we cannot miss a single case. We need a test that catches everyone. But in population screening, specificity is often far more important.
Why is that?
To understand why, we have to look at a crucial mathematical concept, positive predictive value, or PPV. The PPV tells us, if a patient receives a positive test result, what is the actual percentage chance that they truly have the disease?
And this is where the math trap comes in. The textbook points out something that blows people's minds. PPV is absolutely reliant on prevalence, how common the disease is in the population you are testing. The exact same test works entirely differently depending on who you test. Let's walk through the beta thalassemia example from the text to make this concrete.
So, beta thalassemia is an inherited blood disorder. The text describes using a specific red blood cell marker, a mean cell hemoglobin or MCH cutoff of 27 picograms, as a screening test. When this exact test was used in a high-prevalence hospital setting in London, where the disease is relatively common among the patient population, the test had a positive predictive value of about 77%.
Okay.
Meaning if you tested positive in that hospital, there was a 77% chance you actually had the condition.
That sounds great in a clinical setting. But public health isn't a high-prevalence hospital. It is the general, presumed healthy population. Let's do the math conversationally for a second. Imagine a city of 100,000 people. You have a disease with a 1% prevalence. So 1,000 people have it, and 99,000 do not.
Right, 1,000 sick, 99,000 healthy.
Even if you have a great test with 90% sensitivity and 90% specificity, that 90% sensitivity catches 900 of the sick people, great. But that 90% specificity means 10% of the healthy people falsely test positive. 10% of 99,000 healthy people is 9,900 false positives.
Exactly. You caught 900 true cases, but you generated 9,900 false positives. Your total positive results are 10,800. So if a patient holds a positive result in their hand, their actual chance of having the disease, the PPV, is 900 divided by 10,800. That is roughly 8%.
They hold a positive test for a terrifying disease, and there is a 92% chance they are perfectly fine. That is why taking that thalassemia test out to a low-prevalence geographic area caused the PPV to literally plummet to 1.3%. For every 100 people who received a terrifying phone call saying their screening test was positive, 98 of them were false positives.
This is exactly why specificity is king in population screening. If you roll out a national screening program for a rare disease and your test isn't highly specific, you will instantly generate hundreds of thousands of false positives. You will completely crush your healthcare system with terrified individuals demanding follow-up biopsies, MRI scans, and psychological counseling. You will destroy public trust in medicine.
Which perfectly bridges into the economics and ethics of the net. As the UK National Screening Committee defines it, screening is not just a test. It is an entire massive cascade of events. It is the invitation letters, the IT infrastructure to track millions of people, the testing facilities, the diagnostic biopsies for the positives, the treatment for the sick, and the immense psychological support required for the false positives.
And all of that costs a fortune. The text emphasizes opportunity costs here. Public health budgets are finite. If you fund a massive national screening program, you are taking those quality-adjusted life years, those QALYs, and those billions of dollars away from other areas of the health system.
Right.
Maybe a government chooses to fund universal prostate screening, but to balance the budget, they have to shut down pediatric asthma clinics or reduce funding for mental health services. Furthermore, pre-evaluations almost always drastically underestimate the hidden costs, like paying for the massive army of quality assurance nurses required to oversee the program, or the macroeconomic impact of tens of thousands of false positive patients taking 3 days off work because they are paralyzed by health anxiety.
Then there are the deep ethical dilemmas. The text explores the tension between utilitarianism and equity. Efficiency arguments. The utilitarian approach suggests we should only cast our net over high-risk groups to save money and maximize impact. But targeting specific demographics, perhaps based on race, sexuality, or socioeconomic status, can deeply stigmatize them. Equity, on the other hand, argues we should offer the screen universally to everyone, even if it is horribly inefficient and expensive.
There is also the issue of informed choice. The textbook points out that truly informed consent in screening is incredibly rare. Often, tests are presented by doctors as just routine. The patient feels immense implicit pressure to comply. Do they really understand the complex statistics of false positives, PPV, and overdiagnosis before they pee in a cup or get their blood drawn? Usually not.
We also need to address the ethical shadows discussed in the text regarding prenatal genetic screening. The text outlines how prenatal screening forces public health to confront the historical legacy of eugenics. Eugenics literally means well-born, and historically involved horrific state policies of forced sterilization and elimination of undesirable traits.
And the textbook handles this by drawing a sharp line. Modern prenatal screening is entirely legally and ethically grounded in individual reproductive choice. It is about empowering parents with information. However, sociologists and ethicists point out that the aggregate societal implications remain complex.
Because if a state-funded screening program systematically leads to the massive reduction in births of children with conditions like Down syndrome, it raises heavy philosophical questions about value, accommodation, and diversity in human society, even if every single individual choice was made freely. It is a profound debate.
It is. And because the stakes of screening are so high economically, physically, and ethically, the text insists that screening requires ruthless, independent quality assurance and governance. You need a national body acting as an independent steward.
Why? Because local clinics often have direct financial incentives to run more tests. Think of private clinics selling expensive, unproven whole-body CT scans to anxious executives.
Right.
The state has to protect the public from the commercial exploitation of health anxiety.
Governance is incredibly vital because it is practically impossible to stop a screening program once it starts. The textbook gives 2 terrifying examples of policy failure here. The first is from Denmark. They had mobile X-ray units driving around screening a population for tuberculosis. It was a great idea initially during a TB crisis.
Right.
But they kept those units running for 20 years after TB was practically eradicated in the country. They were just unnecessarily radiating hundreds of thousands of healthy workers for 2 decades because nobody had the political will to turn the machines off.
The second example is from Japan regarding child neuroblastoma screening. They started screening infants' urine for this rare nerve cancer in 1985. It made intuitive sense to the public catch the cancer early in babies, but years later, an independent international review looked at the cohort data and realized the screening wasn't reducing mortality at all. It was just finding benign tumors that would have regressed on their own and subjecting babies to unnecessary, highly dangerous surgeries.
They were actively harming infants. The Japanese government finally managed to stop the program in 2004, but the textbook notes they were only successful because, unlike adult cancers, there were no vested advocacy groups or commercial lobbies fighting the science. The public just accepted the data and moved on.
To conclude our exploration of the net, let's look at how screening is applied across the human life course, because each stage presents unique challenges. We've mentioned the antenatal and newborn period. Here we screen for conditions like sickle cell disease and cystic fibrosis via blood spots. But a major dilemma the text points out is that these tests often accidentally uncover carrier status, not just the disease. If a baby tests positive as a carrier for a genetic disease, do the parents have the right to know that genetic information, given that the child is an infant and cannot consent to having their reproductive genetic secrets shared? Plus, these tests frequently accidentally reveal non-paternity, proving the father isn't the biological father. That is an absolute minefield for a public health nurse to navigate.
As we move into adult cancers, we encounter the two most famous biases in all of screening epidemiology: length time bias and lead time bias. We must define these clearly. Length time bias refers to the biological fact that screening disproportionately catches slow-growing, indolent, benign cancers. Why? Because a slow-growing cancer is in the body for a very long length of time, giving your periodic net many chances to catch it over the years.
I love the analogy of catching turtles versus birds here. Your net easily catches the slow-moving turtles, the fast, aggressive, lethal cancers. The birds grow so quickly that they pop up as symptoms between your yearly screening intervals. These are called interval cancers. So screening makes it look like you are finding lots of cancer and doing a great job, but you're mostly finding the turtles that probably wouldn't have killed the patient anyway.
And then there is lead time bias. This is the illusion of extended survival. Imagine a cancer that inevitably kills a patient at age 70. Without screening, they notice symptoms and are diagnosed at age 68. They live for 2 years knowing they have cancer. With screening, we catch that exact same cancer early at age 60. They still die at age 70.
We didn't extend their life by a single minute, but the clinical statistics will show that survival time increased from 2 years to 10 years. All we actually did was move the starting line backward. We didn't extend their life, we just extended the amount of time they had to live with the terrifying psychological label of being a cancer patient.
These biases are at the heart of the ongoing, highly publicized controversies surrounding adult cancer screening. For example, prostate cancer screening using the PSA blood test. The text notes that prostate cancer is extremely common in elderly men, but the vast majority die with it, not of it. Finding it early often leads to aggressive treatments that cause incontinence and impotence without actually saving lives.
The same intense debate surrounds breast cancer screening with mammography. The clinical trials show some mortality benefit, but the modern epidemiological data forces us to weigh those marginal benefits against the massive harms of overtreatment, subjecting women to biopsies, radiation, and surgeries for anomalies that might never have progressed. We aren't taking sides on these specific cancers today, but we are highlighting that the science of the selective net is never as simple as early detection saves lives.
Even cervical cancer screening, which has been incredibly successful at reducing mortality, requires immense effort. The text cites an analysis showing that you need to screen 1,000 women for 35 years to prevent a single death. Over 150 of those women will have abnormal results, causing anxiety and requiring investigation to save that one life. Though, as the text notes, the HPV vaccine is now fundamentally altering that landscape, preventing the virus before the net is even needed.
We have covered an unbelievable amount of ground today. We climbed the watchtower to see how cohort studies build the architecture of natural risk. And we threw the selective net to see the incredible power and the terrifying paradoxes of population screening.
It's a lot to process.
Before we move to our final review, here is a provocative thought for you to take away. Cohort studies give us the incredible power to see into the future of human health. But as our technology improves, as we sequence entire human genomes at birth, as we track our heart rates, blood oxygen, and sleep cycles constantly on our smartwatches, we are essentially turning the entire world into one massive, concurrent cohort study.
That's very true.
We are building a watchtower that covers the globe. And simultaneously, we are casting a net so infinitesimally fine that it catches absolutely every biological anomaly, every minor genetic variance, every skipped heartbeat. The ultimate test of public health in the 21st century won't just be our technical ability to detect disease. It will be our ethical and epidemiological wisdom to know when to leave the presumed healthy perfectly alone.
A powerful thought to end on. To ensure these frameworks are locked in before you head to the clinic or your next exam, let's transition to our rapid single best answer style recall prompts. I will read the prompt, give you a second to think, and then provide the answer and the chapter reference. Prompt 1. Which observational study design establishes temporality by following exposure forward to outcome, making it one of the strongest designs for causal inference short of randomized trials? Take a second. Answer is Cohort Studies. You can reference chapter 5.6 for that. Prompt 2. If a study enrolls individuals who have already survived a certain amount of time since their initial exposure, what specific type of cohort is this, and what bias might it introduce? Think about it. Answer is a prevalent cohort which introduces survivor bias, requiring mathematical adjustments for left truncation. Again, chapter 5.6.
Got it.
Prompt 3. In a longitudinal study, what threat to internal validity occurs if the sickest patients systematically drop out because they are too ill to attend follow-up visits? Answer is informative censoring or selection bias. Chapter 5.6.
The parachute analogy.
Exactly. Prompt 4. Switching to screening concepts. In population screening, if a disease's prevalence drops significantly in the targeted population, which predictive value drastically decreases, even if the test's sensitivity and specificity remain completely constant. Take a second. Answer is positive predictive value, or PPV. Reference chapter 11.4.
The math trap.
Right.
Prompt 5. What is the specific term for the screening bias where survival appears longer simply because the disease was diagnosed earlier without any actual extension of the patient's life? Answer is lead time bias, chapter 11.4.
Okay.
And finally, prompt 6. What screening bias describes the tendency of screening programs to disproportionately detect slow-growing, less aggressive diseases while missing the fast-growing interval cancers? Take a second. Answer is length time bias, chapter 11.4.
Excellent work today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to open up the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health and review chapters 5.6 and 11.4 alongside the frameworks we built today. We will see you next time.
Here are the details of this episode.
Cohort Studies. Byline. Following exposure forward, watching risk unfold over time. Episode description. If case control studies look backward from outcome to exposure, cohort studies begin with exposure and move forward in time to observe outcome. This chapter explores the structure and analytic power of cohort designs. A cohort study identifies groups based on exposure status and follows them prospectively or retrospectively through existing records to measure incidence of disease. Cohort studies are particularly valuable for establishing temporal sequence. Cohort studies are particularly valuable for calculating incidence directly. Cohort studies are particularly valuable for studying multiple outcomes from a single exposure. Cohort studies are particularly valuable for investigating rare exposures. Key methodological considerations include selection of exposed and unexposed groups. Key methodological considerations include minimizing loss to follow-up. Key methodological considerations include controlling confounding. Key methodological considerations include measuring exposure accurately. Key methodological considerations include calculating relative risk and attributable risk. Key methodological considerations include unlike case control studies, cohort designs allow direct estimation of risk and rate. Key methodological considerations include prospective cohorts offer precision and clarity, but can be expensive and time-consuming. Retrospective cohorts leverage existing data but depend on data quality. Key methodological considerations include the chapter also discusses classic long-term cohort studies that reshape public health understanding of chronic disease risk. Key methodological considerations include cohort studies provide one of the strongest observational designs for causal inference short of randomized trials. Key methodological considerations include they allow epidemiology to observe disease emergence in real time. Key methodological considerations include cohort studies begin with exposure classification. Key methodological considerations include they allow direct calculation of incidence and relative risk. Key methodological considerations include establish temporal relationship between exposure and outcome. Key methodological considerations include useful for studying multiple outcomes. Key methodological considerations include particularly suited for rare exposures. Key methodological considerations include loss to follow-up threatens validity. Key methodological considerations include prospective and retrospective designs differ in cost and control. Key methodological considerations include strong observational evidence for causality.